joining us from different parts in the world. It's really good to be back. It was a long summer. I wish that we could say that it was a summer of not continued disaster and crisis, which makes this work really all the more pertinent. So thank you very much for joining us and taking the time. The Hiwar series in SAWI project is very much a manifestation of our mode of working. We use co-creation, thinking together with our country partners in countries across the Middle East and North Africa, but also with activists, employers, HR managers, executives, and government representatives around the questions that guide our research and the ways that together we can begin to implement some recommendations. The SAWI project is basically born from our belief that we're not going to wait and sit aside for the gender gap and for women's meaningful and dignified inclusion in the workplace to happen. We are going to take active measures in order to support and accelerate women's inclusion in economies across the MENA region. SAWI is implemented as a project that is being implemented by the American University of Beirut in close partnership with the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. We're very excited because this is the first Hiwar that SAWI is doing, being a multi-country, multi-university project engaging hundreds of employers who have decided voluntarily to join this effort, share their data, share their insights, and share their constraints with us so that we can together begin changing the formal structures and constraints that women face in the workplace. So I'm really happy to be here. This is intended as a dialogue, so we will not be speaking throughout the whole session. And I'm really inspired to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Yasmin Makarim. Dr. Makarim is Assistant Professor of Human Resource Development at the American University of Beirut. She's also investigator on the SAWI project. And I learned a lot from her work because I'm from political science, so some of the employer business jargon is very new to me. And Dr. Makarim is very patient in explaining to me and others that her work and expertise focuses on what does it mean to have inclusive human resource practices and policies, what could be critical perspective on management practices, and also her third track in research, which is women's emerging careers in STEM. I'll hand over to Dr. Makarim, who's going to present the substance of today's work, findings from this report, and then move on to our third speaker. Yasmin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaha, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It definitely gives me a lot of, pleasure and pride to be able to be here with you this afternoon to share with you all of the research that we have been doing at SAWI, especially when we are looking at issues related to crisis, issues related around HR-informed crisis practices. So what we are going to be discussing today, and with what also Dr. Jaha has mentioned, this 1.5 hour webinar isn't intended to be, just a monologue. Instead, this is a conversation. This is a dialogue that we are having with you, with our partners, and it will be divided into two particular components. The first section of this webinar will be a 30-minute presentation and discussion about research that we have come across from our work around crisis-informed HR practices. What did we find across our 8 focus countries that we work in? What could be different ways that we can approach crisis-informed HR policies, our recommendations, and then we will be really zooming in and discussing the importance of looking through crisis through an intersectional lens as a whole. Our next subset of this webinar will be our Hiwar. And during our Hiwar, we will have the chance to talk with 3 experts, each coming from a different, per se, discipline, but with her own knowledge and expertise dealing with and even living in crisis. So as I move on into this presentation, there will also be some polls that I would really encourage you to answer them so that you can also have like a quick overview about what individuals working across different countries in the MENA region have been facing when it comes to crisis, and what are the different HR practices and policies that you were either you've had that chance to actually implement them, or you are part of the team that is working on implementing them. So just to begin with, when we talk about crisis, defining crisis becomes something that is very difficult. There's a lot of discussion around what does it actually entail when we talk, or what actually entails a crisis or defines a crisis. And how we like to think about it is that in our region, we are really dealing with a lot of unresolved crises that are now becoming part of our everyday life, part of our working lives. We are dealing with crises primarily because they tend to deviate from what is normal, what we consider to be normal in our everyday practices. And in a lot of times, they tend to be a threat to our basic structure of a system. So crisis can take multiple forms and can have impact on multiple levels, whether it's economic, political, natural, human-made, humanitarian crisis. But at the core of it is that it really shakes the structure of the system that we are sometimes, most of the time, used to. So with that, there's a lot that at the organizational level we can do. So when we are thinking about how we define crisis or what actually entails a crisis, we can also start thinking at the organizational level, how do we manage this crisis? Or as you will see me go along in this presentation, is how we can be actually proactive towards crisis, realizing that we are nowadays living with these crises. These crises are no longer coming in as complete shocks to our systems operating in the MENA region. So what can we do? What can we do as HR professionals and as HR practitioners in terms of managing the crisis? But there's a lot of discussion that goes on there in terms of either being reactive or proactive when it comes to crisis management. And we have been seeing that the more proactive we are, the more we have already existing crisis-informed HR practices, the better we are able to handle any shock that comes towards our organization. So crisis-informed policies that we will be focusing on 3 particular areas as they relate to recruitment, retention, and promotion. So when we think about crisis in the MENA region, we're going to start with a poll. As you can see, crises in the MENA region are plenty. They sometimes happen at the same time. Some of them have been with us for far too long. So I would just like to open a poll to try to see from your opinion, what has been, or which crisis has been that had the most impact on the workforce or organizations in your country. So we will take a minute to hear your experiences. I'll give it just a bit of more time to encourage other participants who haven't shared their thoughts yet with us. All right, so let's take a look at the results. So for the most part, major economic recession and the unemployment crisis has been really affecting the workforce and organizations in most of the countries that our participants are coming from. Coming right after is, of course, the health crisis and the implications that have been left due to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on employment, its effect on how we conduct work, and so on. Moving forward with the political instability across many of our countries, which has also affected a lot of our work. How do we conduct work? How do we make sense of our own practices at the organization level? So as you can tell, crisis within the MENA region really is plentiful. and specifically across the 8 country partners that in the SAWI project we focus on, we can tell that economic crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, unemployment, of course, political instability, and as well as dealing with natural crises, including flooding, including earthquakes, has really had an impact on our work and on our organizations and evidently on our workforce as a whole. So how do these crises manifest? So when we are thinking about, crisis, we talk about what they are, but how do they manifest? How are they being reflected into our own livelihoods? So there's a lot of manifestation when it comes to issues around poverty and unemployment. We have a lot of inflations. We have a lot of GDP contractions at our economic level. We have at the political front a lot of corruption and illegal activities that start taking place. We tend to face a lot of wars and armed conflicts, sometimes as a result of poverty and as a result of other manifestation of the various crises that we are facing. There's no doubt that in a lot of countries, there were a lot of oppressed revolutions and strikes that were calling, of course, for the better livelihoods of individuals and of citizens, but they were met with a lot of oppression. So crises tend to manifest in various ways, depending on where you are located, depending on the kind of issues that you are facing. But primarily, they tend to manifest, especially for women in particular ways, whether it's through unemployment or an increased level of unemployment, with a larger number of women who tend to exit the workforce due to facing a particular crisis. We have a lot of manifestation when it comes to the discrimination in terms of accessibility of women to work, discrimination in paid in employment wages. There's a lot of discrimination when it comes to promotion as well. So women during crisis tend to face multiple level of, let's say, oppression or of discrimination, and that could be manifested in various ways. And a lot of these manifestations can be directly linked to various HR practices that are taking place at the organization level. So let's take a look a bit at the numbers. What are the numbers telling us in terms of the impact of the various crises, and primarily on women and on women's employment across the region? So we can tell, and especially crisis as it has been more pronounced due to the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of employed women, for instance, in Jordan, 1/3 of employed women in Jordan did lose their jobs or suffered severe pay cuts due to COVID-19. The same thing happened with Iraq, whereby there has been a 10% increase of unemployment rate as compared to pre-pandemic levels. Other numbers that are also telling have to do with how crisis can also be manifested against women, but more at the personal sphere or in the personal lives of women. When we look at the rate of domestic violence that women have faced, especially in Morocco, with 52% of women reporting that they have experienced an increase in domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. We can also see that around 27% of women in Tunisia who are part of the workforce in comparison to 68% of men in 2019. And that has a lot to do as well with the various crises that Tunisia has faced during that time. So I think this is where it's worthy to take a pause and to try to think about what is our role? What is the role of organizations? What is the role of HR practitioners and policymakers to actually reverse this scenario? We are aware that the crises are there. We are aware that the crises tend to impact and have an impact on women in particular, much more pronounced than it is on other population. But what is the role of us as organizations, as HR professionals to actually do? So what we did during this particular project is that we tried to review publicly available data sources and reports and try to see what did actually organizations across our 8 country partners do. Simply, what did they do in terms of their HR practices in order to respond to the multiple level of crisis that they faced? And this is where we started really looking in depth about the various strategies that these companies have adopted, whether it's at the recruitment, whether it's at the promotion, or at the retention level. And what we included here is just a very brief sample about some of the organizations that were part of this desk review. So for the next 10 minutes, what I will be discussing the crisis-informed recruitment, retention, and promotion policies as exhibited by these organizations. So what these organizations actually have done on the ground to respond to crisis. And then I will conclude with the last part of this review report, where we share our own recommendations around crisis-informed RRP practices. So if we take a quick look at the recruitment policies as a response to crisis, we can tell from the readings and from the research that we have done that there was a lot of focus in terms of what can we do with our existing job descriptions? How can we update them? How can we make sure that we remove any biased terms, any kind of industry years of experience requirement, so that we can attract a larger pool of applicants towards a particular job? And that couldn't have been done if the HR departments or if the recruitment unit wasn't aware of the importance of actually revisiting job descriptions to make them more gender equitable, to make sure that we are really reaching out to a larger number of applicants as a whole. During that time as well, we realized that from the reading that there was some efforts in actually hiring more female employees and supervisors at in various companies, specifically in Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and some of the organizations operating there. And also in terms of recruitment, some organizations out of Jordan, Algeria, and Bahrain really tried to work with universities to equip individuals and students with the right skills, with the right knowledge, so that they are more readily available to join the workforce once a job is available. So there was a lot of partnership with universities as well, and there was a lot of work in terms of providing training to individuals who are aspiring to join the workforce, but might still be lacking particular skill or particular knowledge. And evidently, and primarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized that Bahrain, and specifically Bahrain, really, the organizations in Bahrain really worked on implementing e-recruitment or online forms of interviewing in order to allow individuals to be more at ease when it comes to applying for a job and being interviewed and recruited for a particular position. Next in line is crisis-informed retention policies. So when we are looking at retention policies in response to crisis, the main work that we realized from our research had to do with offering work and family flexible practices and policies, which included personal and parental leaves, allowing for flexible working hours, making sure that there's some balance between remote or offering part-time options. So in terms of retention, and especially for the retention of women, there was a lot of focus on how we can make sure we can create an environment at work where we have family-friendly policies, flexible structures that will allow women who really want to remain at work, remain engaged in the workforce, but who still have other caregiving duties, especially that were very much compounded during the COVID-19 pandemic, to actually still be employed. So as you all know, when COVID-19 pandemic hit and most of the work had to move back to the home, a lot of women did shoulder a lot of the care work while still trying to be as productive and in their own work or within their own careers. So from a retention perspective, focusing on that, a lot of our organizations that we have reviewed definitely highlighted that particular area. In terms of employee support, there was also a lot of discussion about what could we do for our employees. So there was a lot of focus on providing mental health support to employees who might be facing any particular post-traumatic stress disorder, who might be facing any anxiety as it relates to the various crises that the employees were facing. There was a lot of stress around the importance of transparent communication when it comes to what is going on or what will happen to our status at work, what will happen to the projects that we are working on, especially as they were impacted from the various crises, whether it's the economic, political, or the COVID-19. So communication was key. And then trying to make sure that we take care of our employees from a mental health perspective was also key. And what we also realized is that some other organizations also started implementing other policies when it comes to a non-discrimination policy or an anti-harassment, sexual harassment policy at work, all of which took center stage during several of the crises that some of these organizations faced. So when we come to the last, to one of our last focuses, which is the promotion policies, from our work, we realized that a lot of emphasis or a lot of direction has been focused on recruitment and retention policies. As you will see, when it comes to promotion policies, they were very few, to say the least. And actually, in a lot of organizations that we reviewed, especially in organizations based out of Algeria, it had a negative effect. So there were some unmet promotions as was previously promised to particular employees. There were some salary deductions, lack of bonuses and trainings. So when it comes to promotion, we realized that most of the organizations tended to really limit their training budgets, limit their career development practices, that limit their bonuses schemes in general. And only a few organizations really focused on continuous training to their employees, made sure that their employees, even if they weren't able to access trainings physically, that they were still able to access them in a virtual way through holding virtual conferences and workshops. So we realized that promotion, crisis-informed promotion policies were still lacking in a lot of countries. And I think this is where we can take a moment to reflect around the opportunity that gives us, even as HR practitioners and as HR professionals. What kind of opportunity does this give us in order for us to try to inform more crisis-informed promotion practices and policies? So another time, and we would like to hear from you as well. So from your experience in your current organization or in the organization that you used to work, for, did your organization tend to support recruitment, retention, and promotion in times of crisis? We will take a minute as well to answer that. Thank you. Right. Thank you for your participation. I'll be ending the poll. So the majority of the participants did mention that their organizations did support them when it comes to recruitment and retention and promotion during the times of crisis. And for the major focus was on retention policies, followed by the recruitment and then by promotion policies. So this further attests to a lot of the research that we were able to come across, and to the fact that a lot of the organizations did primarily focus on really making sure that we try to retain our current employees in the best way possible, and depending on the kind of organizations or industry that that you're operating in that might have taken different shapes or different ways. All right. So for the next part, I will just be going briefly over what we at SAWI, or from our research, what we tend to recommend in terms of crisis-informed recruitment policies and practices, and as well in terms of promotion and retention. So from a recruitment perspective, and also being in line with a lot what has been done with several organizations in the region, there was a focus around, providing hybrid recruitment, or allowing the interviewee the option to try to choose whether he or she would like to join online or physically, in order to overcome a particular crisis. So being flexible when it comes to recruitment as a whole, making sure that you accelerate the hiring process. We know that a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of obstacles can take place during the hiring process. And in times of crisis, some positions become of key importance. Some departments who might have faced a high level of turnover might require a quicker level of staffing. So accelerating that process would definitely help the organization as a whole address the crisis in a much more, in a stronger manner. Adapting the job descriptions, as I explained, or as I mentioned previously, the idea of making sure that our job descriptions really can attract a larger population group, but also making sure that it really reflects the issues that we are in need of during crisis time, and making sure that sometimes in the recruitment or in the job description, we can mention the kind of practices or policies that we offer at the organization, whether it's part-time options, flexible work options, work from home options. All of these could further entice applicants to actually apply to positions. Some of the recommended crisis-informed retention policies and practices, and as most of you did mention that your organizations did really focus on retention policies while you are working and while you were facing crisis, a lot has to do with how we can offer more hybrid and maybe sometimes remote work arrangements, how we can really focus on employees' health and safety concerns, taking care of his or her well-being, and trying to address issues around burnout. Also making sure that our employees have a stable job from a financial perspective, making sure that they are getting rewarded in order for them, to have a better stability in their job, and putting all of their stress and anxiety at ease to the level that we can really handle, and primarily really engaging in transparent communication. And what we have found, that a lot of organizations who are transparent in terms of where do they stand, what are the next actions that the organization is taking place, making sure that they are very participatory in terms of engaging with the employees as well, have reported better retention rates than others. And concluding with the promotion policies and the recommended crisis-informed promotion policies, a lot of it has to do with how we can really make sure that we can still provide career development support, whether through mentoring, coaching, training and development opportunities, but really making sure that we are there to help our employees still grow within the organization, try to have a better understanding of the kind of transferable skills that they might possess, that we might maybe be able to move them across different units, whether horizontally or vertically, in order for them to really apply all of these new skills or some of the skills that they have acquired in a particular, in a new department or a new role, trying to make sure that, we still constantly provide them with professional development opportunities, whether that is in-house training, online training, and other forms, as I mentioned, coaching and mentoring. And a lot of things that we constantly stress about is really trying to review current promotion policies. The same way we might review certain recruitment policies around job descriptions, we can also revisit a lot of our promotion policies at large. And as I conclude our desk review in general, or what our research really told us, we really need to focus on a very key idea that mostly stresses the notion of intersectionality. So when we are thinking about crisis, when we are thinking about the impact of crisis on a particular group and how does this manifest, we really need to think about it from an intersectional perspective. And by intersectional perspective, we are really looking at how does this crisis affect individuals that are coming from different backgrounds, different gender, belonging to different racial or ethnic backgrounds, and how do these different signifiers really impact how crisis is felt and how crisis is handled. So there's a lot of work and there's a lot of focus that really needs to be added to our understanding of crisis in order for us to recognize and address that inequities in general can be further exacerbated due to the impact of crisis on marginalized communities, and then think about our role as HR professionals and as HR practitioners about what can we do, what are some tailored support mechanisms or tailored resources that we can really think of, devise in order to make sure that we are not really adding another layer of marginalization when we are implementing HR practices and policies. So putting that lens on, trying to understand better that our employees hold different signifiers to them, and we really need to think about how do these signifiers really matter when it comes to the impact and the manifestation of crisis as a whole. And with that, I would be concluding the first part of this webinar. And I would just like to stress that all of the research that we have been doing at SAWI, and especially, when it came to this particular work and the other work that we are doing has been, of course, due to the generous support of MEPI and to the US State Department. And through our collaboration with MEPI, we have been able to really lead on a lot of webinars, a lot of desk reviews, that further the discussion around the inclusivity of HR practices and inclusivity of retention, recruitment, and promotion practices within our region. So having said that, we will now move to the second part of today's webinar, which is the Hiwar. And in the Hiwar, the whole idea behind us actually engaging in this discussion is really for us to have a conversation about the importance of understanding crisis as it impacts the work of women, as it impacts the recruitment, retention, and promotion. And for that, I am very pleased to have two guest speakers with me this afternoon. I would first like to welcome Ms. Aslan. Ms. Aslan is the Gender Technical Specialist for the Decent Work for Women programs at the Regional Office for Arab States for the International Labour Organization based out of Amman, Jordan. And I would also like to welcome again Dr. Carmen Jaha. Dr. Carmen Jaha, as we mentioned earlier, is an investigator with us at SAWI and is a senior researcher in migration and gender at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, Spain. And she's also a founder and the managing director for Solatra Consulting. So I will give the space, I will stop sharing and to move to the second part of this afternoon's discussion. All right. So I would just like to ask Ms. Aslan, please, if you can share with us briefly a bit about your career experience, about your background, and I'll just open it later on also to Dr. Jaha before delving into our Hiwar.
So if I'm not mistaken, if I heard you correctly, you asked me to introduce myself. Thank you so much, first, Yasmin, for the invitation. The ILO is always glad to be part of such discussions. And thank you for the research that you have conducted in the Arab region, where we don't have actually enough research on the topic. So congratulations for the unique work that you have conducted recently and for inviting us. I've been working in development for a long time, over 30 years now. My experience basically was in the international development and gender. Initially, I was working with civil society organizations, and then I moved and worked with the Canadian government. So I was with the donor side, if you wish, with SEED at that time. And then I moved back to the Middle East, and I'm now managing the gender decent work program for the ILO in the Arab region. We focus a lot on, of course, on the conventions that are related to gender, and we work a lot with employers, workers, and government. And I will speak to that maybe later on. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aslan, and thank you for accepting our invitation. We are really very honored to have you with us in this discussion. We realize a lot that the experience that you carry will really add to this discussion as a whole. I would also like to give the floor to Dr. Jaha. Maybe Dr. Jaha, if you can introduce yourself and also give us maybe some reflection on your experience working in countries of crisis and also researching on crisis and migration, of course.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and also a great confidence booster for me to be here, because I think those of us that survived Lebanon in the last few years have a lot to say about crisis. And on that note, I would like to personally thank Dr. Charlotte Karam for her vision, for her support. The way that she has led this project, continues to lead it across multiple countries and time zones, and crisis has helped my career. And to individually thanks our colleagues and funders at MEPI and the US State Department, specifically Ahmed Gutan and Gina Riyad and Maya Barhoush for their faith, their support, and really being able to navigate multiple crises. I have worked in countries of ongoing protracted crisis, including Lebanon until very recently. And I think what I want to bring to this discussion is how organizations can navigate unresolved crisis. It's not an interruption. And I think that Yasmin and I, we went back and forth in thinking about this report, and crisis is a deviation of the norm. What happens if crisis is the norm, with all these open lids of crisis, and how we can work better together for dignified work. And also I will adopt the ILO term on decent work. So that will be kind of my perspective on the Hiwar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carmen, for that. So as we mentioned beforehand, that of course this Hiwar is intended to have a very friendly conversation around really very important topics. So what we are mostly interested in, Ms. Aslan, is trying to understand more from your experience working in ILO and working in other capacities in other organizations. What do you think is the proactive role that ILO has played in assessing and responding to the various crises in the MENA region?
So basically the ILO, just for the people that don't know much about the ILO, it's a unique tripartite structure where it brings the voices of workers, employers, and government to ensure that the views of our social partners are well reflected in our labor standards, which actually speak a lot to what you were talking about, Yasmin, earlier. So the tripartite, they influence and they shape the policies and the programs of the ILO and also the international labor standards as well. The social dialogue also, in many cases, includes civil society organizations and women commissions and media as well, because they play a major role, especially in crisis situations. Now, with the ILO, with the conventions of the ILO, the international labor standards, actually there are so many tools that are preventive tools, if you wish. Now, you talked a lot about, for example, non-discrimination in employment and occupation, meaning that there should be equal opportunities in recruitment, retention, and advancement or promotion in the workplace. Actually, there was a convention, Convention 111, and it was signed by or ratified by many, many countries, including Arab countries. And that convention actually was adopted back in 1958. So if anything, what we're talking about, actually the global or the members of the ILO discussed this topic actually back in 1958, and the convention was adopted at that time. And with the convention, of course, there are tools how to go about that, to include in human resources, in HR policies and what have you. Now, also during the crisis, of course, as you mentioned earlier, there were quite a bit of cases of violence and harassment, such as cyberbullying, because people were teleworking. Also, there was quite a bit of domestic violence. Now, with the Convention 190, which is related to violence and harassment, and actually there HR departments in different companies or employers organizations can adopt a code of conduct to ensure that none of their workers are subject to any type of violence and harassment. And we can go into details if you wish later on. The flexi work arrangements, actually, if anything, actually also, again, there was a convention adopted some time ago where it's related to workers with family responsibilities, and flexi work in the form of teleworking, flexible working hours, and part-time jobs were also adopted a while ago. Again, preventive measure rather than, which can be included in HR policies. And here we're talking about, if you recall, in COVID, for example, there was quite a bit, of course, everybody was teleworking at that time, but also not many companies considered the accommodation needed during that period. And to take, for example, the education sector where most women work, they were working from home. There was quite a bit of e-learning. They were subject to all types of cyberbullying, but also they were not given the tools that they need to basically provide the e-learning courses and what have you. So there they needed computers, they needed to have some network, internet connections and so forth. So digital wages and pay transparency during COVID-19, mobility restrictions were also, it confirmed that there should be some type of protection for wages, and pay transparency should also be adopted by different governments. In the Arab world, there was quite a bit of challenges in relation to digital wages because many were still being paid in cash or through checks or and so on and so forth. So in the ILO, we tackled that a while ago. You mentioned also care. Of course, women were basically responsible for taking care of their children. If they were in the health sector, they had to still work while nurseries and KGs were closed because of the pandemic. But also at the same time, many of them lost their jobs because they wouldn't balance the two. And now here we're talking again about social protection, which is also very, very important. In the countries, the Arab countries that had social protection platforms actually did better than the countries that did not have social protection platforms. Because with social protection platforms, if you are unemployed, if you lose your job and you're registered under the social protection platform, then you can be given some type of a salary during the unemployment. And then it also had an impact on the maternity as well. If you needed some type of maternity protection, it was provided under the social protection platform. Also the medical insurance. In some countries, they also provided some type of medical insurance during COVID, and the cost was also absorbed by the social protection platforms. So it varies from one country to another. Absolutely, there is quite a bit of room to work on in the Arab world to catch up with other developed countries for sure. And I'm going to stop here. And if there are any questions, please go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Aslan, for that. And thank you for sharing a lot of the work that ILO has been doing and also tracing it back historically to what has been done for quite some period of time. And the importance, as you were just mentioning, when it comes to the social protection platform and to the kind of support that women could be able to access to, or others could be able to access to, due to unemployment or due to unemployment as a result of crisis, or unemployment due to any particular reason. As we move into that discussion, I would also like to hear also from Dr. Jaha, when it comes to your own experience around work and inclusion, how do you think the impact of migration and disasters, how can we think of mass displacement, migration as it impacts women's employment in the MENA region? So when we are thinking about everything that's going on with respect to inclusivity, when we are trying to make sure that as part of our policies we can be more inclusive to migrants and to displaced individuals, if you can speak a bit more to that.
Yes, unfortunately, I mean, we're very much a project that's from the region, by the region. So we are not looking at women's experiences sort of from abroad, but really as also individuals who have lived experiences on these issues. And we know that women's careers get disrupted in crisis and disaster much more than men do. And also there are intersectional identities, as you showed at the end, Yasmin. So not all women are affected in the same way. And unfortunately, what we are seeing in the region, especially in places where there are weak governance structures, that there aren't sufficient national level policies, or they exist on paper, but they are not implemented as mechanisms, is that we are seeing employers and decision makers sort of left on their own. And I was very inspired to see in the poll that we just did that really the majority of the people on the call today have taken measures when companies or employers have experienced disaster and crisis, take active measures in order to protect women's career and women's access to decent, dignified work. But what we see in places with weak governance structures, such as the disaster in Libya right now, where people are still counting their dead, and what we saw in Morocco, unfortunately, what we saw in Lebanon after the explosion, is that this situation creates chaos and leaves women to be treated at the whim of their employer, their HR manager, their boss. And this creates a huge burden on women. I remember one of the interviews with a nurse that really stuck in my head. She said, I want to work. The people in the West think that Arab women don't want to work. She said, but should I risk my life to get to work? Because to get to work means driving in dark roads, perhaps being attacked by a non-state armed group, earning very little money and not being able to be protected in the workplace against harassment, against bullying. What we also hear from women's experiences in crisis and disaster is on the structure of benefits and retention. Women need more support when disaster occurs, when the electricity goes off, when buildings fall down. Women need much more access to benefits in a region that already does not offer equal benefit in relation to home care, the care for elderly, for children. So we are seeing a lot of this exacerbated effect. Unfortunately, one of the issues that we can work on, and I like your framing, Yasmin, perhaps there's an opportunity there. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of similar patterns. And sometimes when I hear scholars, experts, activists, women speaking in different parts of the region other than Lebanon, I feel like it's very similar to our experience. And this is both unfortunate and a call to mobilization, in that what can we do together in taking the recommendations from your report that emerged from this public reading of policies and practices, and thinking together with ILO, with other partners, with our colleagues in the countries where we operate, around how we can learn from these patterns where literally the women are either left alone, that they must literally risk their lives to go to work, or the employer, so well intended, is saying, I'm really trying my best, but this is a humanitarian crisis. I can't hire certain people, I can't retain them. What we can do together.
That's interesting. And I think picking up on that, Dr. Jaha, especially when you are discussing the national level focus, and this is also what we know, what ILO really strives for or tries to focus on. But a further interesting point to that discussion would be if Ms. Aslan, you can share with us, in what ways is the ILO trying to integrate or work with organizations, with employers, to actually implement a lot of the policies or a lot of the recommendations that you discuss?
Okay, so basically what we also try to support is, as I mentioned earlier, voices of workers and employers. In the past and before COVID-19, I'm only focusing maybe on COVID-19, and maybe we can expand the conversation later on. But during COVID-19, actually, because employers saw how we basically organize group of female workers. And we have what we call the Stand Up with Teachers campaign. It's a campaign that started back in 2015 in Jordan. A group of female KG owners, they approached the ILO and they asked us to help them organize themselves so their voices can be heard. As I mentioned earlier, as ILO, we work in a tripartite manner. So the employers came to us and they asked for our support, and we were able to organize them in a manner where they were able to establish a committee, a national committee for owners of KGs, mainly women actually. And there we started to connect them with decision makers, and they did influence the policies in Jordan, meaning they did receive subsidies of wages during COVID-19. They were able to reschedule their loans. They were able to be included under social security protection schemes. So we help them do that. And that's the part where ILO can support, it's organizing them, getting their voices heard. At the end, with the Stand Up with Teachers campaign, now we have what we call a legal clinic, because we felt we need to expand this type of work to other sectors as well. And with the female-owned KGs, actually, we do have also a business clinic, just to get it more organized and to have it more sustainable kind of approach in the country. Now, other countries are learning from the experience of Jordan. I'm just giving this as an example because we don't want the conventions just to be conventions. We want them to be implemented. And to be implemented, we need to be working with other two groups, even if legislation is national legislations are aligned with the conventions. It's not necessarily, as you mentioned earlier, they're not necessarily being implemented and enforced in the country. In this case, we were able to enforce, for example, the digital payments for female-owned schools because we had the Stand Up with Teachers campaign. And we again linked them with policymakers and so on. So there were many, actually recently, they have succeeded in having a collective bargaining agreement with the new rights for the private education sector teachers. And again, mainly 88% of teachers in the country are females. So that's why we focus as a gender specialist. And because I manage the Decent Work program for women at the ILO, we basically focused on the sectors that employ women the most. And I'm gonna stop here, thanks.
Thank you. But I'm just curious to follow up on that. So what was the result? Was it in terms of retention? You were able to gather data in terms of the teachers or being retained more? Were there any particular outcome from that kind of work that is worthy of highlighting further?
Actually, with the female-owned KGs, the majority of them maintain their businesses. And to us, that's very important. It's not just because we want to encourage women to stay in business, but also to maintain the jobs of women that are working in that sector. So yes, it did basically have a huge impact. And now we only have anecdotes at the moment. Maybe early next year, we will also do a more detailed assessment of the success of the business clinic. But to us, it was very important that we didn't want women during COVID to lose their jobs. And of course, KGs were closed, so there was no income for the business owners, but at the same time, they had to pay salaries. So, and these are women, again, that didn't want to close their business. They wanted to provide decent work conditions for their workers, but at the same time they were having financial crisis because of the pandemic. So, and with the Stand Up with Teachers campaign, actually with any campaign, usually somebody pays a price. I have to say some of the teachers at the beginning of the campaign actually lost their jobs because they were part of a campaign and it was not highly acceptable by their employers. So they basically did let them go. But at the same time, now what they are a very powerful group. They can negotiate with the employers. As I mentioned earlier, they were able to introduce new rights under the collective bargaining agreement, and which is actually for the people that are not really into details when it comes to legislation, it's part of the legislation. So it becomes binding for all the schools in Jordan to abide with the new rights that they have. One of the things that they face, the Stand Up with Teachers campaign, and we do have numbers on that, I don't have them on me, actually, many of them did not receive their salaries during summer breaks, for example. Now with the new collective bargaining agreement, the contract should be for a full year. And if there is an interruption in their wages, that means they cannot benefit from all the insurances that the Social Security Corporation in Jordan provides them with, including maternity leave, including unemployment, including pension. Their pension will be interrupted and so on and so forth. So I hope I answered your question. Thanks.
You did. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. All right. So going back also to Dr. Jaha, I just need to make, yes, I'm sorry, it got lagged a bit from my end. So also, Dr. Jaha, from what you have been discussing earlier and from your experience, how responsive do you think various MENA stakeholders, whether it's organizations, governments, and other stakeholders, been in actually implementing inclusive strategies to help leverage migrant and women's talents amidst times of crisis? So not just necessarily focusing it at the organizational level, but at a much more broader level?
I think it's important to position MENA with what's happening globally. Many authors and advocates have come out to speak about a backlash, and the example I think that kind of Reem gave as well is that there is a backlash on some of the gains that women have made in the economic realm. In MENA particularly, and with migrants and refugees leaving MENA, this is exacerbated because women's representation generally in national politics and national policy making tends to be low. So when crisis or disaster occurs, and I see Reem shaking her head already, the voice and the platforms where women can speak up and advocates and allies tend to be deprioritized. So there is a global and a regional problem around recovery strategies that tend to leave, women's rights as an afterthought. We'll think about it later. Now we build roads. We will think about women's unemployment. Men are also being unemployed. And there is a systematic de-skilling of female migrants, because also that's a huge disruption to women's career when they leave and become also dependent on new forms of employment, often informal, unstable, so on and so forth. I speak on women in academia in particular. That's the sector that I'm in. So there is a regional problem. There's a global problem, but there is a regional specificity in that the national structures that are meant to sort of regulate or advocate on behalf of women remain underrepresented in those places. And so when crisis and disaster hit, the people dominating that conversation, whether they are well-intended or not, politicians, international donors, large businesses, will tend to deprioritize this, which is why I think, not to continue talking about SAWI only, but as a model to create a transnational network of no matter where we are, we're going to work together for the MENA, come up with solutions and work with the stakeholders that directly have a benefit in employing and sustaining the lives and careers of women. We do not ascribe too much to a business argument. We're not telling businesses, look, in crisis, it's important to hire women because you'll make more money. We're making a social development argument in that if you leave women out of disaster and crisis response, any disaster and crisis, it could be an earthquake, it could be a flood, it could be a pandemic, it could be mass displacement. But if you leave women from that space of decision making, then even a most well-intended recovery will remain exclusionary for women. So that's my take. So I think the policies have not been responsive, and there's a long way to go. But I think the way to go around it is through these regional networks of support of no matter where you are and how you are, you're able to speak when there is a deviation from the norm, particularly a continued deviation from the norm on things related to social security and benefits, and access to employment, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaha. For that, I was noticing also, Ms. Aslan, that you were confirming a lot of what Dr. Jaha was mentioning. So I just want to give you some space to see if you would like to share any of your experiences as it relates to what was been discussed.
Maybe I will focus on the decision-making positions, having women in high position during COVID-19. Yes, absolutely. In the Arab world, maybe women were not involved, or at least there was not a critical mass of women that were influencing the policies that were adopted during COVID-19. And to that, actually, ILO is actually the custodian for having women in managerial positions and boards. Which is part of the SDG 5.2.2, if you know the details of the SDGs and the indicators. So actually, we've been working heavily on that. In Jordan, again, what we found is working is basically bringing women together. So there was a coalition that was formed recently, and because of the coalition, and it was basically established by the Jordanian National Commission for Women with the support of the ILO, we succeeded in introducing for the first time in the company's law, a representation of women should be on boards of all companies, public and private. And at the same time, the Central Bank of Jordan made an announcement that all banks should have a 25% of boards by 2024 women. So we're also lobbying for that as much as we can. But again, as ILO, we only respond to requests. So whenever there is a request, we support our partners, and we usually the social partners, again, employers, workers, and government, we always work with them, and we need to make sure that they are all on the table at the same time. So we don't actually work on any initiative without having the three around the table, because we don't want to have we want to have a positive impact on the economy of the country. And as you noticed, actually, one of the things maybe that we did not also mention is the fiscal budget in most of the countries did not take care into consideration. And actually, when there is a crisis, usually that is the first thing that governments let go, not just in the Arab states, actually, it's all across the board. So women even, they will not get, if in some countries, maybe in the Arab world, we don't have that yet, like tax benefits, child tax benefits, certain subsidies for childcare facilities and what have you. This is the first thing to go, or at least they reduce it. So women also have more burden during the crisis. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Jaha.
I would like to ask you, Dr. Makarim.
Sure.
Bala doctor, I think is
easy.
But let me ask you, because also you work on organizational level, meso level, right? Or organizational change in terms of policies. You focus on employers. You have insights from HR managers. And I wish, Yasmin, you can tell us more a little bit about what happens. What are the pressure on organizations, on employers? Because what I see in migration and what I saw when I was based in Lebanon is a big push on entrepreneurship. And I also have a quote from my research and our research: not all women in my village are going to become entrepreneur. The majority of women will enter the formal sector. Entrepreneurship is good, but the majority of women, estimated hundreds of thousands, will enter employment level. So from your experience, Yasmin, what have employers done good? What can be done better? What's the importance of this conversation at the business level or at the employer level?
Absolutely. So thank you for that, Carmen. So from my research and from my experience, I've had the chance to witness a lot of support from organizations, or a lot of organizations that are really well intended in terms of really taking care of their employees, trying to understand what are the various practices and policies that could be put in place to make sure that we are retaining our employees, that we are providing them with dignified employment, and so on. However, what has happened, especially in the past couple of years, that a lot of the crises that came across were, of course, non-planned, unimaginable. They were not accounted for in the basic structure of the organization or in the basic structure of the various HR departments or systems. And I think this is where the key focus should be. From my personal opinion and also from my research, we realized that the more flexible, adaptable our systems are, the more agile our workforce is, the more we will be able to withstand any crisis that comes our way. So a lot of times our organizations are still working in a very bureaucratic manner, very hierarchical manner, following very strict regulations, policies, and procedures. And when a crisis hits, because we are deviating from this norm, because we are trying to understand the crisis and its impact on our work, and if I am to say it from a very organizational perspective, on our business, on our profitability, on our revenue margins, we really start thinking about, we rarely think about what does this actually mean to my workforce. And this is where the HR practitioner's role becomes key. We really need to make sure that the kind of practices, the kind of policies that we are pursuing, we are implementing, are agile, are adaptable. They allow us the room to actually absorb the crisis, try to have a better understanding about the impact of the crisis on our workforce and on us as individuals working at the company, as women working in the company, and what can we do about that? So there's a lot there in terms of unpacking the various challenges that women face while being employed, adding to it the layer of crisis, and then trying to understand what is it exactly is the role of HR amidst all of this conversation. But I think to its core, realizing how quick we are in responding, and not just necessarily being responsive towards the crisis, but really trying to be more proactive. So beforehand, trying to understand, and as you mentioned, this is a conversation that you and I had multiple times, that these crises are there with us to stay. They are unresolved, as if we take, for instance, the Beirut blast, as we take, for instance, other examples, we have a lot of crises that have been unresolved. So we are at a point in time where we really need to think that, all right, as HR professionals, our practices can't remain very static. We really need to be much more dynamic in how we approach our own policies and procedures, because we need to realize that living with crisis might be the new norm. So it will no longer be maybe a deviation from the norm, but it's actually the new norm that we are operating in.
Thank you, Yasmin. I was going to ask you about a recommendation, but I feel you answered that. You recommend that employers and all of us stakeholders here put a 5-year plan of addressing
Absolutely.
crisis.
I mean, addressing crisis, I think maybe another, if it's in the line of recommendation, other than just being, open and understanding to the idea that crises are there and they are now part of our system, part of our functioning as a whole. We also need to try to think about how, for instance, we can leverage technology for that sake, how we can make sure that our systems, our existing workplace structures are further supported through technology. And I think this builds up on what Ms. Aslan mentioned earlier on, that a lot of organizations, let's say during the COVID pandemic, asked employees to work from home, but they did not provide them with any kind of support to actually work from home, neither in terms of training to utilize particular online resources, neither in terms of, for instance, in Lebanon, not having proper internet connections or stable internet connections to actually do the work, and neither kind of support if you have a care role duty at home or within your personal sphere. How would you address that? So it's easy, anyway, it's easier to come up with the solution of let's work from home in order to address a particular crisis, but not delving into the details of it might actually not allow it to be as successful as we intended it to be.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up. And just on that note, like basically what you're saying, Yasmin, is not to leave women to fend for themselves and
Absolutely.
to keep an intersectional lens, because some women may not even have the space to work from
Absolutely.
home, physical, geographical space. So basically, if you're listening to us, you are employers, you are advocates, don't leave women to figure it out on their own. Women want to work, but we need support. And on that note, I would like to open the Hiwar session. Yasmin, we can, both of us, facilitate this, but also call on the spot if Fida Afuni would like to speak as being an expert on HR and the MENA, of course, Charlotte Karam, any of our co-PIs and colleagues, and any of our participants, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Ideas, suggestions, criticism, something we missed, something you learned.
I think this also is also a time to,
if you wish to speak, raise your hand and I can unmute you. Sorry, Charlotte.
Nasreen also.
Nasreen as well, and Fida.
Yeah. Charlotte, go ahead.
I see Nasreen's hand and Fida's hand, so I'll wait for them to go.
Okay.
Nasreen, please.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to see the great faces here again. It's great to connect with Sawi. This movement that came in a point very critical in Lebanon. Allow me please to speak about Lebanon. This is Nasreen Deeb. I'm the director of the Lebanese League for Women in Business, where we work for women economic empowerment on all levels, from different backgrounds and from different areas in Lebanon, and especially in the rural areas who don't have internet access and those facilities. So I want to repeat again and again in each Sawi gathering that the Sawi movement came into a critical point in Lebanon. So in the first poll, when I was going to pick what is the most crisis that affected us, I really got lost. Which one in Lebanon? Because we have faced most of them. So it was very hard for me to pick which one. And here, speaking about at an organization itself, what we do is we support other employers and organizations. But sometimes we reach a point where we need support ourselves. We support people in drafting policies, and we might be forgetting the path going ourselves in supporting our employees in order so they can support the others. I just have one comment on the last conversation that happened between Yasmin and Dr. Carmen about maybe what we should learn and 5 years strategy. I agree and disagree a bit. I can say that the strategic and the long-term strategy should be there, but it should be updated and improved. And we have to go back to the policies and review it, especially in a country like Lebanon and mainly in the MENA region. We cannot catch up on the crises that are happening. We hope that we reach to a stable level soon and for the future, and we can draft a strategy for a long term. However, we cannot ourselves in the last period, whether the fuel, whether the electricity, whether the turnover in each and every organization, the talents are leaving the country, and ourselves as management or as HR, it was really very challenging for us to keep updating our policies. Yet we need to do some basic or some base, like maybe the internet and the others, definitely if we have the luxury and the support to have the infrastructure readiness and the ground ready for the employees and for others. However, those 5 years of plans, we should review them from time to time at LLWB specifically and in SAWI. And we have learned as an organization in order to support the employers, where we went back to our policies and we improved them. Until today speaking, we're in October 4, we're in 2023, we might have some policies that are not written, but we are applying them. So sometimes you might not have them written on the spot, but you need to test them. You need to test them with the employees. You need to test them with the people. And then you go back to your policies and you draft them and you make them official. So thank you so much for this interesting discussion. And we always look forward to learn from SAWI movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nasreen, for your comment. And I think it has a lot to do with what we did tap upon earlier with respect to, revisiting whether it's promotion policies, recruitment policies, how we design job descriptions, how we are designing our promotion trajectory. So there's a lot of focus on the fact that, as you mentioned, we can have a plan set, but we need to constantly revisit it. Also making sure that sometimes we have the room in our organizations to actually experiment. A lot of organizations tend to sometimes penalize individuals who experiment and then end up failing or the likes. But I think to the core of it, in order for us to make sure that, we are trying new things, we need to make sure that the culture at the organization level really allows for experimentation to take place. And that experimentation can also take place at the level of HR practices and policies. So thank you for that. Thank you for that input. Sal, can you let us know who has their hand
Okay,
raised?
I think I've been unmuted, so I think it's me next.
It's you.
So thank you, very engaging discussions. I love the nuance you did between, crises that are passing and crises that are here to last. I want to say, from my experience dealing with HR managers, whenever a crisis hits, we always believe that it's going to be short term. And we have examples, from the civil war to any crisis, the economic collapse, the political instability. But I think on the moment when a crisis hit, and it's really surprising us, employers find short-term solutions for survival and for continuity of operations. And at this moment, we see that women are hit strongly and in a disproportionate manner, because if you take the pandemic recently, non-essential jobs, mostly we know, are occupied by women. These have been eliminated. Not everybody can work remotely, so those jobs, were let go, and the jobs were terminated. And we see also that women who stayed have been exposed at a higher level of hazard and risk, like nurses, etc., where they have to be on the ground. So automatically, the first response to a crisis, there is a gendered response where women are at a disadvantage. And then once we start to realize that this crisis is here to stay, we start thinking of, how can we move from surviving to thriving? And here, I think another problem is that the decision makers, as you were discussing, and those who set the policies mostly are men, and tailor solutions to them. So I think it's very important to keep in mind, for me, and this is something that you also brought up, bringing women on the decision-making table, regardless what the decision is key to ensure that any decision or any practice or any policy that is developed will not have a negative effect or will privilege some groups over the other, be it gender or other categories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think just building up on the last point that you mentioned, building women to the table of discussion also from an intersectional perspective also allows us to have a better understanding of their own experiences. So being a part of the decision making, but also making sure that their experiences, their voices becomes also more center in those rooms or in these particular boards that are mostly occupied by men. So thank you for that. I would like to ask Axel if we have.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Hello,
Sorry.
everyone.
Hi.
Okay. First, I need to thank you for the meeting and honored to be part of this movement. Well, I have one question, and I need to ask or understand more about the intersectional lens and how it affects our work modality, and how can we implement it in both crisis and certainty or clarity modes. Thank you.
Carmen, can I leave this room for you to reflect on that?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, go ahead, but please go ahead.
Sure.
It's in
Thank
the
you.
report, no? And I can comment, but it's your.
Yes, I thought he was just addressing you. So thank you, Naji, for that question. So when we are thinking about intersectionality as it comes to our work, or as it comes, to how we are dealing with crisis, or once we are dealing with our, daily lives, what really matters is that we try to understand that any individual that we might be working with or we might be working for comes with multiple backgrounds, and these particular backgrounds that he or she carries or signifiers, whether in terms of religious belongingness, sectarian belongingness, ethnic belongingness, whether it comes to gender identity or the like, might have an impact on how they actually in terms of how they actually come to face crisis. So for instance, if you are looking at an individual who might have a particular disability, crisis will impact him or her at work differently than if we are dealing with an individual who is more able or who is more able from a body perspective. So intersectionality really just allows us to be more sensitive to the various embodiments that we carry as individuals. Because as you know, at work, we are not really just bringing in our professional self, we are also bringing in our personal self. And our personal self might have, might carry multiple forms, multiple experiences that become center to how we come to understand the world, how we come to understand what impacts our work and what impacts our livelihood. So when we are thinking about intersectionality, we're really trying to make sure that we are being more attuned to how people bring in their individual self to the work sphere. And when we are being more inclusive or mindful of that, when we are designing our policies and practices, our policies and practices become more inclusive, more understanding to the various signifiers that each one of us carry. Because each one of us has a certain level of privilege, and with that privilege comes a different way or a different let me say that, a different approach with how we deal with things, depending on the positionality that we carry as an individual, depending on the privileges that we carry. And those become somehow centered within our work environment, especially if we are looking at it at an organizational level.
And
I
just
hope that answers.
Yes, it was a difficult question. So that's why, Yasmin, as an expert, you answered it. But basically, my takeaway from this session, and also from what Nisreen said, is experimentation, right? So Naji, the way to think of intersectionality is, God forbid there's an accident, it will not affect all women in the same way. And from an employer perspective, it might mean that different benefits and different practices need to be adopted to different needs of women. We are not all the same bulk. We don't look the same. We're not educated in the same way. We don't have the same capacities. And when crisis and disaster hit, it may be that there may not be one size-fit-all policy. And it's important for employers to be aware that discrimination occurs at different places. We're going to be putting out some content on that. Sometimes someone's accent, where they're from, what they look like, their skin color, can subject them to more harm than someone else. And that's the whole idea of intersectionality. We're all hit by disaster, but we're hit differently, and some people more than others.
Thank you, Carmen, for that. I would just like to leave the space for Ms. Reem if you'd like to add anything before I conclude our webinar for this afternoon.
So again, as you all mentioned, I think women face challenges differently. And I think what we encourage people to do is to have like listening sessions with different workers, different employers. And again, bringing them together with the government is very important. So even employers, they shouldn't take the burden of certain things on their own. They should bring it to the attention of the government, especially when female-owned businesses, again, because they don't have a critical mass and they are not represented enough in governments, many times, their needs are not well heard, or they're not well reflected in the policies that they adopt. So I think it's very important, again, to organize women groups, be it workers or be it employers. And again, even women that work in governments, actually, they also face similar challenges, because if in a boardroom or in a committee or what have you, high-level committees, actually they face a lot of challenges because there is, again, no critical mass. And the ILO studies actually show that at least 30% of women, they need to be on boards or in a committee so they can have an impact. And some people think having women in such positions is just, what is the value of that? Actually, again, the studies of the ILO did show that it will increase the employment of women, and the work environment will be more inclusive and provide actually decent work conditions, the ILO language, and there is more of social justice. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for this excellent webinar, and thank you for inviting the ILO, and we will continue the discussion. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aslan, for being part of this discussion. And before I conclude, I know Dr. Karim wanted also to have some time to speak. So please go ahead, Charlotte.
And maybe she can answer the difficult questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to be unmuted. Thank you all. I mean, what a wonderful, insightful conversation. It's really wonderful to see the participation in the chat and to hear all of your insights. I learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I'm not going to answer any of the questions, but I've been following the questions in the chat. So I'm going to give my time for conclusion just to raise a question. There's so many, and unfortunately, we don't have time for everything. But the question about brain drain, particularly in crisis, is one that I think hits home for many, many people. And we did touch upon, Yasmin did mention it a bit during her presentation. Reem, can I put you on the spot? And then maybe if Carmen and Yasmin want to also, but let's start with Reem. I'll read the question. So it's from Wahida in Tunisia, and she says, we're very challenged today by brain drain. People from all majors and expertise are leaving Tunisia. So my question is, how can we retain the people when it's a political and economic issue, and how can we replace the experts when the replacement itself is willing to leave as well? It's an excellent question. It's an extremely hard question. I don't think anyone has the answer, but some insights would be very welcome. Reem, can we start with you? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'll try. I'm not an economist, but actually I did touch on macroeconomy and the importance of investing in unemployment, actually, to investing in the country to reduce the unemployment rate. And it is a complicated question, and there is no clear answer from my side, again, because I'm not an economist. But what I will tell you, actually, during the crisis, we did work on one sector, which is the fitness sector for women. Actually, yes, we did lose many of the women after they were trained and they were accredited by different agencies here in Jordan and abroad. Actually, they moved to the Gulf. So maybe it's not just actually skilled workers. Usually, if they find better opportunities, they move on. And I think it's the responsibility of the government, again, to find solutions for that. And over to you. And I'm sorry I didn't answer the question, but it's not an easy question, as you've mentioned, Charlotte. Thanks.
I mean, all right. I think from my perspective, because obviously this is a very, like it's a multi-level question, but I think a lot of individuals that end up leaving, they either leave because the workforce is no longer investing in their growth and in their development at a more intellectual perspective, and they believe that other opportunities, sometimes abroad, will actually do that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities if the organization critically really reflect on the importance of these employees within its premises to actually work on further developing their intellect, their skills, providing them with career development opportunities, with trainings. And sometimes, as we face, sometimes the brain drain is really because of national level issues that are sometimes out of the control of the organizations. And this is where it becomes really tricky in terms of how you can make sure that for instance, as an employee, I don't want to leave my organization, but I want to leave my country as a whole due to the crisis that are impacting it. So it's not easy. It's not easy to answer this.
I see that Fida's hands up. Maybe she wants to answer.
Go ahead, Fida.
Yeah, I just have a very simple answer, for a complicated question. So people work for two, reasons. They expect either financial reward or they expect meaning. So in times of crisis, we cannot offer money. Often the salary is cut, the benefits are cut. So providing meaning can be something really important, and providing an inclusive environment where everybody feels that there's meaning to what I do beyond just getting a very low paycheck can make people stay and make a difference. And oftentimes from my research, it becomes a patriotic act. So we want to stay in this organization and we want to contribute to keeping the country together, to restarting the economy, to fighting the political corruption. So you can speak to that aspect, and it doesn't cost a lot. And it creates, like the work becomes a haven of, a safe space where I feel good amidst a country situation where everything is chaotic.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fida. Reem, Carmen, Yasmin, everybody, our country partners, and everybody in the room today. We're and on our live channels. Thank you so much for joining today, and thank you so much for the insightful conversation. I hope that this is just a moment in an ongoing conversation, an ongoing invitation to work together, whether it's with SAWI or beyond on these important initiatives. We appreciate the ILO and Reem for being part of this conversation. We admire your work, and we're so grateful for you being here today. Yasmin, over to you. And I think
thank you very much. Of course, I won't have anything else to add except to really thank you very much, Reem, for being part of this discussion. Also, Carmen, and to everybody who attended this and who shared their questions. We're really very appreciative that you are part of our SAWI movement. There's a lot of work that is being done to really make sure that our organizations become more inclusive and our HR practices to really have an impact on the women who are employed within the borders of these organizations. So I have nothing else to add except to thank you a lot and to really hope that at some point we won't have to be dealing with these kind of really traumatic crises that we are dealing with at the moment. So thank you very much for attending and for your time. Have a very good afternoon.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.